What's going on YouTube, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Max. In today's video I'm going to be doing a comparison between the Samsung S95C that you see on your right, the 2023 QD-OLED, versus the Sony X95K, the 2022 TV, the mini LED. Now if you could do me a favor first by hitting that like button and that subscribe button, I greatly appreciate it. First things first, I want to go ahead and do a comparison between both these TVs to see how between the S95C and the X95K. So what I'm about to go ahead and do is show the settings. Right now I have everything on default for the Sony X95K. You can see right here, gradation preferred, custom. Usually custom mode is the most accurate when it comes to Sony TVs. Other than that, everything hasn't been changed on here. Everything is pretty much identical. Now on the Samsung, on the other hand, if I go ahead and go to filmmaker mode, everything is the same on its default settings. The only thing that's changed is, pretty much nothing. Everything is on its default settings. Now looking at this one particular screen right here, I have everything paused on Mandalorian, Season 3, Episode 2. I'm looking at this and both of them are pretty similar to each other. I will say that the Sony X95K is a tad bit brighter in this one instance right here against the S95C, but looking at them, they're pretty close. And looking at Sony on the X95K, I do want to give kudos to them because looking at their picture quality of mini LED against a QD-OLED, it looks pretty good. It looked pretty close to each other. I do consider that the Sony X95K is a little bit better when it comes to their color and a little bit of the picture quality. But the Samsung S95C, especially with the infinite contrast and when it comes to absolute blacks, when it comes to the S95C, it's really good. Now when it comes to brightness, I am going to switch some settings up just to show how the S95C did a good job. So let me go ahead and switch to the settings. Now the only thing I'm just going to change on here is just a HDR tone mapping. And I went ahead and changed from static to active. And just to show one thing too is I'm still on software 1100. So I haven't updated the Samsung TV as of yet. I have everything offline at the moment. So I just want to let people know about that. But looking at this, if I switch static to active, in this particular instance, the S95C is brighter than the X95K. Now the X95K, I haven't changed anything. There's the default settings. Now if I went ahead and switched it to custom mode, that's kind of like my settings. Both of them are pretty close to each other. But at the same time too, looking at the Sony X95K, when it comes to black levels, if you look at the black bars, you don't see any blooming. The black bars look absolute black in my eyes. So that's something just to think about if people who are concerned about the Sony X95, especially when blooming. I mentioned it earlier that I do prefer the colors a little bit more compared to the Samsung, but the detail wise, both of them are pretty similar. Now the Sony X95K is bigger than the 77-inch, but my opinion, I think the detail would be a little bit better on the Sony side compared to the Samsung. So that's what I'm just observing right now. But looking at the QD-OLED, man, this is the QD-OLED Samsung display, Samsung, they're getting close. They're getting close to mini LED, and this is the mini LED for 2022. So this is getting me really excited just to see this. Looking at the Samsung S95C, against the Sony X95K. Now, in this particular instance right here, I will say that the Sony is brighter, but it's not by a huge margin going against the S95C. But this is me with, only thing I just switched up on as in brightness wise is I just did brightness preferred on here. So let's go ahead and do gradation preferred on here. And then same thing for Samsung. If I go back to filmmaker mode, and so it's active to static. And then what I have to do is I have to go up on my exposure and looking at exposure on the camera specifically. But if you look at this, I will say that the Sony X95K is brighter, but looking at Samsung, man, it's pretty close. It's pretty close with this TV, with both TVs. So anybody will be happy with either or. Even though the Samsung, I'm talking about when it comes to brightness against the X95K, the X95K, when it comes to, if you look at the blacks, when I'm talking about black bars specifically, it is very comparable to what you see on qd-oled on here. So if people are wondering about the Sony X95K and they've been on the fence with this, you will be happy. There are certain situations that you do see a little bit of blooming here and there depending on the content, but this one I don't see it at all. So I just had to throw that out there. But looking at the shadow details and looking at Mandalorian specifically, yeah, it's close. It's close between these two. So as I mentioned before, these are default settings. And then if you want me to go, I can even reset this if you want me to. So I reset the picture settings and you can see right here, everything is the same. So yeah, it's crazy just to see this. Here's another scene right here, just showing that Sony X95K and the Samsung S95C, both of them are in the default mode once again. Yeah, they're pretty close and stuff. So of course, you know, if you switch active and if I change it to brightness preferred on the Sony X95K, they are close. But Samsung sometimes, depending on the content, it looks a tad bit brighter than the Sony X95K in certain instances, which is very, very shocking. So if I go ahead, just to show an example, still in filmmaker mode. So it's just the active. Same thing for picture settings on here. Oops. And I'm gonna have to lower the exposure on the camera. Yeah, you can see right here that both TVs are very close to each other when it comes to brightness. This is just one particular content, but looking at them and looking at my view, the Sony X95K in this particular scene is a tad bit brighter, especially if you look at the background of that building and even some of the Androids that they show right there. It is a tad bit brighter, but it's not something with it by a huge margin. So if you look at the Samsung S95C, it's pretty close. If you didn't have these TVs side by side to each other, and I really am just like pulling strands of hair trying to nitpick on this one, but on the 2023 version on the Samsung S95C against the 2022 Sony X95K. If you're talking about specifically brightness wise, both of them are close to each other. Alright, here's another scene right now that I'm looking at. Samsung S95C against the Sony X95K. Now, the reason why I'm doing these dark scenes, just to show how Sony X95K has done a good job, especially when it comes to the 2022 model. On the Samsung S95C, they also did a good job as well. Right now, I have both of them on their default. Now I'm about to switch this to active. And Sony, I'm just going to do brightness preferred. The exposure a tad bit. Yeah, looking at both of them right now, I think anybody would be happy with either TV. Yeah, both of them are good. And just looking at both of them compared to each other, looking at the Sony X95K, when it comes to, I'm looking at the shadow detail. Yeah, I see more on the Sony X95K compared to the Samsung S95C. If you look at the trees going to the right specifically, and then you look at it compared to each other, you can see a little bit more detail. You can see a little bit more detail on the Sony side compared to the Samsung. And when it comes to looking at the highlights, when it comes to looking at Spider-Man and Electro in the background forming, spoiler alerts, if anybody who haven't seen it, you see Electro in the background, Jamie Foxx. It is brighter on the Sony X95K, but on the Samsung S95C, it's pretty close. I'm letting everybody know. I'm throwing everything at it, and man, this is crazy just seeing this. Samsung, you did a good job. Sony, you also did a good job, especially when it comes to being a mini LED, first mini LED to use a backlight master drive. I mean, both TVs do a good job. So I think it comes down to a use case scenario between both TVs. If I didn't have these side by side, yeah, I'm just looking at it. It's both look good. So here's another steal right now. This Transformers Bumblebee, if anyone is curious. And I'm looking at Optimus Prime on both the S95C and the Sony X95K. Now, when it comes to contrast wise, yeah, without a doubt, hands down, I think Samsung is better on this one. So as a settings wise, I have Samsung on active and I have Sony on brightness preferred. That's the only thing I change on these two. And looking at it when it comes to brightness wise, they pretty close to each other. And I think that's one of the things that I just wanted to show and demonstrate between both TVs. When you comparing the mini LED to QD-OLED, on the mini LED TV, it is a little washed out and faded compared to the QD-OLED. It's a lot to do with its contrast, the infinite contrast that QD-OLED provides. So that's one thing I do want to let people be aware of. You don't notice this at all if you don't have these TVs going square neck and neck between each other. But since I do, that's something I do notice between both TVs. Now, when I went ahead and switched this up to back to its default settings. So right here is static for tone mapping. And of course, contrast enhancer is off on the Samsung S95C. This is all default as well too. So looking at both of them, so once I put it back to default settings, so if you looking at the Samsung S95C specifically, you switch from active to static. Static is, you know, I'm not a professional calibrator, but this is going to the more accurate realm compared to active. So compared to, I'm looking at Sony, if you use gradation preferred, that's more getting to the more accurate setting when it comes to picture quality. But both of them do a really good job. So if I switch back to default, the Sony, on the other hand, will be brighter in this instance. But it's not by a huge margin either. So both of them look very similar to each other. Samsung definitely has the better contrast compared to the Sony X95K. Even when I'm looking at Samsung colors at this moment right now, they did a good job this year compared to last year. With the Samsung, you do see push of red on the 2022 version. 2023 version, it looked like they did do a better job to my eyes from looking at it and comparing it between each other. So that's one thing I just want to call out as well. But looking at both TVs, if you look at Optimus Prime specifically, if you look at his head compared to each other, there is a little bit more shadow detail on the Sony compared to the Samsung. You can see a little bit of black crush, but I mean, you're not going to really notice that when you have that TV. Especially if you look at his arm definition, you see a little bit more on the Sony as well compared to the Samsung. But it's not something, this is something I'm just like really nitpicking on. Just throw that out there. But when it comes to contrast, yeah, the Samsung is better. When it comes to brightness wise, both of them are close to each other and stuff. So this is pretty much all I wanted. Let me know in the comments what everyone's thoughts are between this comparison between the Samsung S95C against the Sony X95K. Let me know in the comments. Are you thinking about buying qd-oled for 2023? Are you thinking about getting the Samsung S95C? Or are you still going to hold out for the Sony A95L? Or are you thinking about getting the Sony X95K, the 85-inch version specifically? You can see how Sony has done great strides with the 85-inch version on the X95K. Are you thinking about picking that up since it's discounted? Or are you thinking about getting the new mini LED Sony X93L or X95L? Let me know in the comments. About to go ahead and sign off, but if you could do me a favor by hitting that like and subscribe button, I greatly appreciate it. Until next time, I'll see everyone in the next video. Take care. Thanks for watching. Bye.